Welcome to episode 4 of my podcast. It still doesn't have a name because it's still that new. But I'm joined today by Ash Pigott, who is a registered dietitian. She is a fan of myth busting in terms of fad diets and would rather focus on nutrition and basically evidence-based food intake. But Ash, let me just hand over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey so far, and then we can jump into talking about diet and nutrition.
So I'm Ash. I'm a registered dietitian. I've been a registered dietitian now for about 14 years. I've worked across a range of different settings. So most of my career I spent in NHS settings, in both paediatric and adult settings. I'm really interested in preventing tricky relationships with food, and I'm currently doing my PhD, exploring interventions to prevent disordered eating in type 1 diabetes specifically. But I also do a lot of freelance work, working with people to rebuild healthy relationships with food, to explore what good nutrition and nourishment means for them. I'm particularly interested in sports nutrition, and I certainly feel that we as women are not always very good at recognising that when our bodies are very busy, very active, that they need a lot of really good quality, high quality nutrition to support that.
So you've mentioned 3 different things there, which I think which I would love to just explore further. So the first was the type 1 diabetes and disordered eating. Now, we actually met when we were doing our TED Talks because we shared a stage. And I've rewatched your talk this week and it's excellent. And you speak about a made-up person called Amy who has type 1 diabetes and develops an eating disorder. And you talk about the mortality rates. Can we just tell us a bit more about that? Like, how common is disordered eating with type 1 diabetes, particularly in teenagers?
So I guess the question is first of all, we know that disordered eating is really common and that tends to kind of emerge during adolescence. So lots of people around us will have experienced some level of disordered eating. At one point in their life, they may have had a tendency towards extreme dieting behaviour, and that doesn't always escalate into a full-blown eating disorder. When it does, an eating disorder by itself is incredibly dangerous. But when we add something like type 1 diabetes into the mix, so as a dietitian, my role working with children and young people with type 1 diabetes often involves teaching them to accurately count the amount of carbohydrate in the food that they're eating. So they become very aware of what they're eating. We now give them special technology so they can see how they eat and how their glucose rises when they eat and how it doesn't rise or stays flat when they don't eat. So all of these are quite triggering and potentially push young people towards more extreme dieting behaviours or kind of fuel really complex relationships with food, which can become really dysregulating. Now, the problem with type 1 diabetes is that to survive as somebody with type 1 diabetes, you have to take insulin. It is life-saving. It keeps people with type 1 diabetes alive because it allows them to absorb the food that they've eaten and turn that food into energy. If we take insulin out of that picture, they will not absorb the energy from the food they're eating, but they may become very unwell. And over time, they will become very unwell and cause lots of damage to their organs and be high risk of being admitted to hospital in life-threatening diabetic ketoacidosis. So it's about twice as common for somebody with type 1 diabetes to have an eating disorder. Wow. But we reckon about 60% of people with type 1 diabetes will have significant disordered eating behaviours, which are impacting their life and their well-being. And my message really from the TED Talk is that we have to change how we perceive food and nutrition to protect people like those with type 1, but also those without, to have more positive relationships with food and not to be completely fueled by thin culture or thin ideals.
And when you refer to disordered eating, what exactly do you mean by that?
So that's a really good question. And actually, it's quite hard to quantify. There are lots of things that are, could be considered as disordered eating behaviors. And, I might say, if you look at some of the diets that are trending on TikTok, some of them fit as disordered eating behaviors. Some of them might actually be packaged up quite well as an eating disorder. But any sort of dysregulated eating, so that could be, fasting all day, for example. Overeating can be quite disordered eating behavior. This idea about not listening to our body and following what somebody else says. The definition for disordered eating behavior is rather vague, and it's quite open to interpretation. But really, anything that is making you feel out of touch, disconnected from your body, and not actually eating for the purpose of nourishing your body is probably not quite right. It's not always a problem. Lots of things we do, for example, Christmas, where we all overeat and we enjoy that, doesn't necessarily mean that it's problem behavior, but it's that pattern and that kind of continuation of that behavior is where it becomes problematic.
So where do cravings come into this? Because you can be listening to your body, but have a craving to eat, I don't know, a bag of Haribo. And you can say, well, I was listening to my body. So how does that fit into the idea of disordered eating?
That's it. And that gets mixed up and muddled up quite a lot when people like me come along and talk about this idea about intuitive eating, about listening to our bodies. And people think, well, my body wants donuts all day, so does that mean that's okay? And it's it's almost, when we're talking at that level, we're going in too high level. Actually, your body is telling you it needs energy. Why is it telling you that? How have you fueled yourself for the rest of that day, the previous day? Classic example is we live in a culture where everything is about demonizing carbohydrate. So lots of people will try and cut carbohydrates, say from their lunch, and they don't know why at 3 o'clock their body is screaming for sugar, because that carbohydrate, which turns into glucose and fuels those muscles nice and slowly during the afternoon, isn't available. So their very clever body is sending them a message saying, give me glucose, give me sugar right now, not in the form of a whole grain wrap or some whole grain rice. It's telling you, I want pure sugar to get into those muscles straight away. So when our body is shouting at us and giving us cravings like that, it can often be a sign that we haven't fueled well, maybe the day before, the morning before, previously. And we need to think about our strategies, because sometimes we miss that kind of idea about why we eat. And do we eat for the purpose of pleasure? Sometimes that's great, but mostly we're eating for the purpose of giving our body the energy it needs to survive. When we start messing around with cutting things out or removing entire food groups, we then often create these cravings. We also put food on a bit of a pedestal. So you automatically make an assumption that Haribo, because it's high sugar, is bad. So it becomes a bit of a something to think about and occupy a lot on our mind. And there is an argument that yes, it is a much less nourishing food than a balanced meal. But if we start glorifying it, we then start to put it in a different box. So there's something about food neutrality, and trying to see all food as having a space in our diet, and not putting things into this good and bad box that we so naturally do.
Yeah, I understand that. And I guess it all fits into having a balanced and varied diet. But a lot of people can struggle with impulse control. And I think then for those people, so let's say you have binge eating disorder,
Yeah.
but those people lack that ability to say, okay, I'm just going to have the recommended 3 Haribos, which is one portion size or however many it actually is, because that's not like even that's we have one piece of Haribo each. When someone brings it to a hockey game and then the whole team shares one bag, and that's one piece of Haribo going round, and that's probably the only time I've ever eaten less than multiple.
And sugar, sugar gives us that hit. It gives us that energy that our body needs, and our automatic reaction when we consume it is to want more. That is, I wouldn't say, I mean, some people can only have one Haribo, but most people will have that desire to go and go and go. And I know I hear a lot, and there are different trains of thoughts as well in terms of eating disorder behavior or disordered eating behavior, about whether we need to treat food consumption more like an addiction, or whether we need to think about how we manage and fuel that body. And at the moment, the best way around that is, if we're struggling with impulse control, what is going to help us to manage our impulses? And we know that having a clear, concise way of thinking, having that fuel going directly to our brain can help to manage those impulse control. So whatever the solution is about the Haribo, whether it is not to buy the giant bags, that's a different question to actually, what have I put in my body that day that will allow me to think clearly when I am exposed to that situation where I know I really struggle to regulate my own appetite. I'm not eating to appetite. I'm eating for a bit of a hit to kind of keep me going. And I think we sometimes jump and start blaming the Haribo and start saying, well, I can never have Haribo again. Of course, that might be part of your solution. But the first solution is actually, what am I putting in my body that is giving me the good nutrition, the right fuel? It's a bit like a car. If you're putting diesel in your petrol car and you don't know why it's chugging and making all weird noises, actually, if we're not putting the right fuel in to think clearly and rationally and make those decisions, then of course we're going to start reaching for that instant hit. It's not always one option doesn't always solve the other, but I think we tend to go straight towards what's bad, what we shouldn't have, the worst things. We know that 99% of us are not meeting our nutrition requirements, yet our first kind of option when we're thinking about food and nutrition and health is we start thinking, oh, what can I take out? What do I need to remove? What do I need to hide or never buy, never have in my house again, like Haribo? And it's a lot more nuanced than that.
So then how do you encourage people to regain, or to even develop for the first time in their lives, a healthy relationship with food?
Do you know what? It's often so much more simple than anybody ever thinks. If we look at any of the guidelines around managing weight, for example, or managing disordered eating behaviours, or even eating disorders, the very first thing that we need to do from a nutrition perspective is stabilise our eating. Now, that can be really confusing in a world where we're exposed to messages around fasting or cutting down or cutting out, is actually getting our body having regular meals at regular times in portions that are starting to allow us to listen and slow down. So the first thing I'll always do with people is map out, how can we get you consuming some nutrition every 3 or 4 hours? How can we get that nutrition to have some carbohydrate, some slow release energy in the carbohydrate, some protein, and some fruit and veg? And getting that nutrition into somebody's body every 3 or 4 hours, thinking about any sports or activities they're doing, making sure that they're fueled for appropriately. And then building on that, looking at things like mindful eating. How are we eating our food? When we're eating, are we actually paying attention to what's going into our body, and are we recognizing what's happening? So for example, I know if I eat my sandwich at my desk, I'll finish my sandwich and then ask, what's for lunch? Because I won't even realize that it's gone into my stomach. So acknowledging and allowing that body that time to recognize. So it's about regulating meal pattern, trying to connect with our food again. And what people struggle most with is not being too prescriptive with how much somebody should have. So moving away from very kind of fixed ideas about portion size, starting off with a guide, but having that permission to wait. And if you want more, allowing that, as opposed to perhaps we've always been told this is the recommended portion, these are the recommended calories. We're so dysregulated from actually listening to our own bodies. So it's definitely, first of all, it's building on good nutrition, and then it's building in that kind of connecting with our body again, which is really, really tricky for lots of people.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when we go to, you mentioned earlier that people have demonized carbs, and the wellness world has really demonized sugar. Why do you think that's happened? Because I understand that there is a role for continuous glucose monitoring, but there's such a big push at the moment for just your regular person to have a CGM, which I think is ridiculous. And we're then pathologizing normal sugar responses and trying to say we need to reduce this sugar spike in people who don't have diabetes, and making people really anxious about their own health. What have you seen in practice, and how do you help people to overcome that? Because that kind of content is everywhere on social media.
Yeah, and it's really concerned me over the last kind of 12 months or so. I think the social media, the number of companies that are now launching their own versions of continuous glucose monitoring, and I guess the regulation around that, or how they're testing that is going to be quite interesting. But you've hit the nail on the head. These devices are built for monitoring glucose changes and glucose deviations in a population of people with diabetes. We don't have any long-term data to suggest that actually putting a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, on a person without diabetes results in any long-term changes. But what we do know from a diabetes perspective is wearing a CGM can actually increase distress around eating and can increase anxiety. So we don't know if there are any benefits, but I can certainly see lots of areas for harm. I've certainly worked with a few people who have been on a certain research study where they pay to be part of the research study and they receive a CGM. And these are people who've never had any history of disordered eating behaviours, but actually what it has done is triggered quite significant distress around eating. They've often come to me fasting for extended periods of time, then binging and overeating because of dysregulation, because they just were not sure what to do and how to manage it. So we know that pre-diabetes, so people at risk of diabetes, may see some of these deviations and make some changes. We don't know if they're going to be long-term or not. But for many of us living without diabetes or without pre-diabetes, our glucose rising and falling is a completely normal response. The fact that it goes up and then comes down is a sign that our body is producing insulin. That is okay. If it is going far above 11 and staying above 11, we have got a problem and that needs further investigation. But actually, we don't need to stop the rise and the fall. And certainly from a clinical perspective, working with people with diabetes, I've tried these devices before they became popular. And they're not always that accurate because they're, as in they are accurate, they're useful kind of diagnostic criteria. But actually, our bodies are amazing. They're making lots of little micro adjustments in the background. That these are exactly like you said, pathologizing normal glucose variation, and it's not right at the moment, and we haven't got the evidence to recommend it for health.
Okay, so you talk about the CGM monitoring and this app. I'm guessing that you're talking about Zoe. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert on Zoe. My kind of knowledge of Zoe is what I've probably been exposed through social media, the own targeted ads I've had it myself, and friends and family that have tried it. From looking at some of the research around it, I mean, first of all, what a clever idea to market your own research study to get people to be part of it. It's fantastic when you think about it. I think what they're looking for and investigating is really, really interesting. And they're obviously going to have the numbers to add power to some of the data that they collect. So from a science perspective, well done them. My concerns are that it is a research study and people that are entering or engaging in it are being given messages around food that don't necessarily come from that strong an evidence base. They're learning about their bodies, but without some of the psychological support, perhaps, to address some of the health anxiety that might come with wearing a continuous glucose monitor, for example. And anybody I know that has done the Zoe study and has been given recommendations, often the changes that they are recommended to make include adding more fibre into their diet, reducing the amount of ultra processed food that they have, and having fueling for exercise. So they're the main things I've picked up from friends and family that have done it. And they are messages that we would be giving anybody. So it doesn't seem, it concerns me, but I think what worries me a little bit as well is some of the pushing towards fasting and extended fasting, which doesn't suit everybody and doesn't necessarily screen for any history of disordered eating behaviours. So well done them for creating a fantastic and very well-powered research study, but some concerns about the impact it's having at a population level, and also that bias. They're targeting people who can pay, so you're going to get a very biased sample of participants.
That's true. But they basically receive a lot of flack from a lot of health creators and a lot of doctors. But equally, there is a big push amongst the lifestyle medicine cohort of doctors who really believe in what Tim Spector says. Moving from that onto another really common fad diet, which is everywhere at the moment, the carnivore diet. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've made content on it and I get all of these carnivore bros just trying to slate me in the comments, saying that there's no evidence that red meat causes bowel cancer. There's no evidence that red meat leads to cardiovascular disease. And I'm just like, this is established science. And if you're going to tell me that if you're going to make an extraordinary claim and say that all of this stuff that all of our guidelines are based off is wrong, you need to demonstrate and point me towards some extraordinary evidence. And they never can. They just say, oh, just Google it yourself, or go find it, or there's this one doctor who talks about it. And they say, this is nonsense. This is actually nonsense. And I stop engaging with them. But I'm trying to put out more accurate information about it. But it is just a supremely restrictive diet. It is a restrictive diet. So there will be health benefits in the really, 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 really short term, because you're cutting out almost everything that might lead to things like IBS symptoms. You're cutting out all of the legumes and fresh fruit and veg. But the long-term effects of it are going to will be catastrophic, because like the Lyon Heart study showed that. So they basically gave people a Mediterranean diet, a traditional Mediterranean diet from the 60s and 70s, and tracked their like heart disease scores and things like that. And they found that within 3 years, their risk of recurrent heart disease had fallen by 50 to 70%, which is phenomenal. We can't achieve that kind of reduction using medication alone. And the Mediterranean diet is phenomenal. But so many people now are trying to push towards carnivore, and I just don't understand it. What's been your experience of it?
I guess you kind of touched on a couple of topics there. The first thing is that kind of alliance that people have with diet and the type of diet that they choose, and how kind of how passionate people can get if something works for them. And often the reason that they care so much is they really want to share that message, and they feel, if only I'd known it when. But there is almost a bit of I can't even think of the word, is that kind of almost has become a religion for many people, the type of diet that they affiliate to. And you do get that kickback. And the same way, it probably the same as talking to somebody who was an avid Christian, or and if you kind of said to them, there's no such thing as God, you're getting that same result. And I think it's kind of acknowledging that sometimes we try and present lots of evidence and arguments, but this is something that they really believe in, and it seems to have worked for them, or they believe it is working for them. The issue is when they're then pushing it on other people and potentially causing more issues. But it's interesting you mentioned about the Mediterranean diet, for example, is incredibly effective. We know physiologically it works. We have an answer. We have the answer to what healthy eating looks like. We know that. But why is it not working? And this is the problem, is actually it's how maintainable any behavior is, or any diet is within our own lives. And therein lies the problem. So because actually we might have an answer, a solution, but it's the implementation is the hard thing. Instead of us exploring what the implementation problems are, we suddenly go back to, and we think as people, well, I can't implement 5 fruit and veg a day, so I'm just going to only eat meat. We can't deal with process sometimes. We can't deal with changing our own behaviors. So what we do is we jump out of that and we look for the next magic answer. And we're seeing that time and time again, whether it is a carnivore diet, a paleo diet, a cabbage soup diet, all of those are much more simple. The rule basis of those are quite clear. I know what I'm doing. I don't necessarily need to change my habits elsewhere. I can just follow this one rule, as opposed to rethinking a whole relationship with food. It's a bit like, do you want to set up a savings program of £100 a month, or do you want to come into my get quick rich scheme? Most people would rather get quick rich than to save gradually, because it's just much more sexy, really, isn't it?
And that's the problem with traditional medicine. Everyone thinks that they know everything now because there is so much information available online. But being able to discern what is accurate and what is false can be difficult, particularly to a layperson, particularly when things are packaged in such a in such a sexy and sensationalized way, and that happens around diet.
And it happens around diet more because I know I got myself in a muddle. I had some issue with my arm and the nerves were kicking off. So I ended up on a road of Googling, but I don't really understand nerve physiology or anything like that. So I can see how you can fall down a little bit of a hole. The problem with food is because everybody eats, and I really welcome the wellness community and more holistic practitioners talking about food a lot more, because it does have an impact on all of us. Because everybody eats, though, everybody has an opinion, and nobody is stopping and questioning how that opinion and how it's portrayed can actually impact others. And we haven't necessarily got very good regulation around who can say what. From a medical perspective, I'm sure you get lots of people coming out with strange and wonderful medical queries, and certainly in your TED Talk you talked about that. But from a nutrition perspective, it tends to be a lot more subtle, lots of little kind of confusing, conflicting messages just constantly being exposed everywhere, whether it's on social media, whether it's on the playground, whether it's in work. And it can become really, really hard to decipher. And I guess certainly me as a dietitian, I feel that we as dietitians, as medics, as nutritionally informed therapists, whatever our profession is, we've got a responsibility to be calling out some of that misinformation or questioning, and trying to put ourselves up as the gold standard. And certainly, you talk a lot about nutrition, and I really welcome that. That's fantastic. The worst thing that we could ever do as professionals is for me to start saying, oh, Dr. Suj, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Is actually, we need to work together to make sure that the messages we're giving as regulated professionals are seen as that gold standard, and challenging some of that misinformation underneath.
I completely understand that. I had a whole module on nutrition at university.
Oh, did you? That's good.
That was a long time ago, and in practice we don't it's become more to the forefront now, but talking about nutrition and exploring someone's dietary habits and trying to elicit change is a lengthy process, which as a GP, in 7 to 10 minutes, it's really tough to do that. So we end up signposting to trusted sources. So I usually say go to the NHS website. There is the British Dietetic Association, which is also great, but it can be really tough to be able to really explore people's ideologies during such a short period of time.
And it can be really disengaging for you to see somebody with obesity, for example, and to make a suggestion that, oh, you need to lose weight or you need to eat better. That can sometimes make them completely disengaged from you as a practitioner, as opposed to what they really need is a conversation. Oh, can you talk to me a bit about your eating? And then you don't have that time necessarily to follow up and give some of those messages. But I think there is something in that about, it's fantastic that you're able to signpost to evidence-based resources, and certainly the BDA have got some lovely food fact sheets, some really nice information. But sometimes, as you know, if people feel things are thrust upon them, it can become really, really difficult. I certainly know that where colleagues of mine have really valued are things like your motivational interviewing behaviour. So that power of like a very short message, a very short open conversation to give them that leeway in. But yeah, it's not easy. I certainly do sympathise. But I mean, I'm just impressed that you had a whole module on nutrition and that you recognise that you can't cover everything, but that it is an interest to you. And I love that you do lots of it on social media. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you. Just finally, just about the Mediterranean diet again, it's also the culture within the Mediterranean where, for example, so I went to visit a friend who lives in Greece, and when we went to a restaurant, the standard thing is you would order this big bowl of Greek salad and just put it bang in the middle of the table, and it was reasonably priced. And I mean, you could eat that as your meal, but it's just had so many vegetables in it as part of the salad, and it had the drizzle of olive oil, and it was delicious. And we don't really get things like that in the UK, where you can just get this with every meal. You just get this big bowl of salad that just goes into the middle of the table, and everyone helps themselves. You might do it at home if you're hosting, but we don't really get that in our restaurants here. And I think that's part of it's just this. It's part of the culture that needs to change fundamentally to be able to influence better eating.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's lots of talk, particularly in Wales at the moment, about legislation around fast food and takeaway food and making it harder to put offers on. But actually, what we don't think about is how can we make it easier to make more nutritious options. And, you know, you talk about Greek culture. My in-laws are Greek Cypriot, and we spend a lot of time having these long extended lunches. Whereas I come from a family where we had to eat our food super quick to get out the door, to get to that next activity. And it's very, very different, that value and focus that people put on food. You know, in lots of European countries, food is the centre of the day. People stop for 2 hours to eat their lunch. We don't necessarily have that here. And again, it's thinking about reconnecting with how we're eating. If we're spending a lot of time eating in front of screens, eating in isolation, bringing that sense of community back into food is definitely encouraged. But you are right, we do need those nudges to make accessing that really nourishing food even better. And we're talking about this at quite a high level. You know, you've got to remember some people are living in households where they haven't got access to enough money for enough food, and they're having to make really, really difficult choices about you know, it's not even can I afford any fruit and vegetables, how can I get the most amount of energy for my pound to survive until payday. So you know, even where we're talking is a lot higher level than lots of the population can perhaps engage in.
And that's really, really sad. And even at in a educational level, like school meals in this country, if you compare it to, for example, school meals in France, they get like 3-course meals. If you want bread, you go to a bakery to get bread. It's not ultra processed. It doesn't have all the emulsifiers and things like that. But I know we're approaching the end of our time together. Do you have any final remarks before I just quickly sum up?
No, I hope that I met your expectations. It's just been really nice to talk food and to talk nutrition. I think you're doing a fantastic job, and certainly we as dietitians love to have people out there questioning the evidence, being trolled as well in a way that we often get trolled, for saying what is common sense advice, but just don't forget to understand that some people really strongly believe in some of the messages that they're pushing, and that's okay for them.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ash. I think that was a really lovely, insightful conversation about all things diet related and how we can, first of all, recognize disordered eating and how we can try to develop our own healthier relationships with food. So thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been brilliant.